that we have almost everybody here, so I will, without further ado, introduce our speaker for today. So firstly, thank you for all coming to our latest Members and Patrons event, which, as you can see, is called Mid-Century Modern. Our speaker today is Elain Harwood, who is an architectural historian. She's with us thanks to the C20 Society, who have collaborated with us to organise this event. And with Elain, we're going to be celebrating not only the pavilion's 87th birthday, which took place yesterday, but the launch of her new book, Mid-Century Modern, which celebrates British architecture from 1938 to 1963. So as the pavilion enters its 87th year, this is almost the story of what came next and how these mid-century and many modernist buildings reshaped the towns and cities of Britain in the years that followed the pavilion opening. Elain's going to look at several of these buildings that are featured in her new book. She'll talk for about 50 minutes, and after the talk, she's going to have a quick in conversation with one of our trustees, who's also with us today, Daphne Tyson. Daphne's an architectural historian as well. She sits on our board and Capital Appeals Committee, helping us to manage the future of the building and look at ways in which we can invest in it. I'm also joined by two of my colleagues, Pippa Moore, who is head of fundraising. I'm sure many of you know Pippa and have met her before. I'm also joined by Joseph Constable, who is our acting head of exhibitions. Some of you may have met him, and for those of you who haven't, hopefully you will have the chance to do so in the new year. So without further ado, I will pass over to Elain. Elain's going to say a few words about the 20th Century Society, who have made this event possible, and then go into all of these fantastic buildings featured in her new book.
Oh, thank you. It's lovely to see, well, virtually. I wish I could see you all. I can't. I hope you can see and hear me okay. And well, happy birthday to the Delaware Pavilion. And we're just saying how I first saw the Delaware back in 1988, when you could just walk in and the bar had its flock wallpaper and the crisps were past their sell-by date. And then a couple of years later, coming back with the 20th Century Society, when we hosted an event there with Mendelssohn's daughter and Birkin Haywood, who was the very young assistant on the building with Mendelssohn, and he sort of led us through the roof with its steel structure and explained how the steel stairs worked. And it was one of those sort of quivering moments when you were just glad you were there at that time. It was a really memorable occasion. So honoured to be back. Lovely hearing that there's been so much happening during lockdown in the restoration. But as you were saying, this is about what happened next, and architects realizing that white painted concrete was perhaps not the easiest thing to maintain in a British climate. And indeed, if you look at Sir Shemaev's own house in East Sussex at Halland, sure some of you know it, recently listed, despite all these alterations. It's a timber frame of Australian Jarrah wood on a brick base with brick on the other elevation as well, but mainly clad in timber and glass. So something very different from concrete. And if you look at the work of their contemporaries, Marcel Breuer, another Jewish emigre from Hungary, worked at the Bauhaus, came over, formed a partnership with FRS York, Midlands-born architect. And the same movement happens, but you can see it sort of more clearly, perhaps. Here's a seaside house, largely by Breuer, out towards Littlehampton. And it's concrete, it's raised on pilotis to give the upper rooms a better view of the sea, because it's like one street back from the sea. But then York and his assistants, Randall Wells, had the huge problem of thinking about how to thread services through a flat roof. And I said York was from the Birmingham FWB York, also an architect, was the architect of Flowers Brewery, and passed in Stratford-on-Avon, and passed on this little commission for brewery workers' cottages, a little terrace, to opposite direction from where the tourists go, the north side of Stratford. And you can see it's got local stone walls from the Cotswolds. Its roof is a monopitch. If you can see my cursor, it slopes in one direction only, a very Scandinavian feature for letting snow slide off roofs. And it's got brick walls, and yet it looks intrinsically still modern. And this was the evolution that they described, and that York combined architecture with journalism and made this point in his books on the modern house, which went through several editions between 1934 and the late 1940s. And in 1944, indeed, he built himself this little weekend cottage on the Isle of Wight at a time when the rationing of building materials was still very much in force. There's still a war on, after all. And his argued that this was a sort of prototype of a new prefabricated system. So very small, very modest, but still there, apart from its windows, on a landslip site. So dodgy foundations. There's a massive sort of concrete raft underneath this thing. But you can see again the sort of simple, slightly sloping roof, the mixture of concrete and brick and timber and stone. And this eclecticism seems to be the sort of feature of what might have happened to British architecture had the war not got in the way. And it mirrors a sort of movement around the Western world. So here's Le Corbusier combining concrete slabs and stone in his student hostel on the south side of Paris, acknowledging that there was a local quarry, but producing something that was both more decorative and, one suspects, rather easier to maintain. Mary Crowley, later Mary Med, very much influenced by Denmark in her architecture, and you can see another of these monopitch roofs that's very much like what York was doing with his little terrace in Stratford-on-Avon. And even Frank Lloyd Wright with his Usonian houses, looking to combine sort of the flat roofs and simple forms of the modern movement with timber and traditional materials of the prairie. This is actually a sort of modern take of a building that was planned but never built. It's part of his campus for Florida Southern College at Tampa, which claims to have more Frank Lloyd Wright buildings than any other location. I'm going to try not to cough. Sorry. But Frank Lloyd Wright had not really been an influence in British architecture during the 1930s. We were much more aware of his acolyte, Willem Dudok, in the Netherlands, who knew Frank Lloyd Wright's great Vasmus folio published in Germany, and sort of adapted a lot of Wright's ideas into modern public buildings such as Hilversum Town Hall. And that, apologies to Daphne for such simplification, but Dudok had an enormous influence on school buildings in particular across Britain. But Wright himself remained little recognised until the end of the decade, and he's awarded the RIBA Gold Medal after Dudok in 55, Frank Lloyd Wright not until 1941. And he comes over in 1939 and he lectures. And Robert Townsend, another architect journalist writing for the Architectural Review, big glossy monthly news magazine on world architecture, but with a British base, celebrates Frank Lloyd Wright's 80th birthday in 1947, and his own house in Wiltshire shows the influence of Wright with those big horizontal eaves, the use of brick and solid timber very, very clearly. And another architect based in Warwickshire, actually again, had an office in Stratford-on-Avon, Robert Harvey. This is his own house west of Stratford, just on the edge of the Cotswolds at Ilmington, I think shows this Wrightian influence very clearly indeed. And Harvey, as a student, sort of discovered Wright. I think there's a little coterie at Birmingham University who discover and get enthralled by Wright's prairie houses, or Usonian, United States, a sort of modern vernacular, modern interpretation of traditional ways of building. And they correspond during the war. And this is Harvey's homage. A rather poor photo from a 20th Century Society visit to Finland. We do quite a lot, or did, annual tours around Europe and Cuba, United States, and further. But this is again using the local materials, stone and timber, to realise something that is fundamentally modern. And you see by the date how the war stops this kind of building. But it's predominantly Denmark and Sweden that really had the fascination for architects at the end of the 30s. I think because Stockholm, for two things. Firstly, this exhibition of 1930, organised by Gunnar Asplund, an architect who moved from classicism to modernism at this point. And note the sort of slender columns, the use of bright colour, towers, rather constructivist elements too. You see here the sort of site on the eastern edge of Stockholm by water as a mix of pavilions showing the latest in home consumer goods with a fun fair. It's combined the South Bank and Battersea pleasure gardens all in one go. And architecture in Sweden undergoes this sort of shift in the 30s from classicism. This building was hugely admired in Britain. You can, I'm sure, all think of town halls and university buildings that have these sort of copper top knots and sort of carillons and clock towers. And I believe too that Stockholm, particularly the work of Carl Milles, introduces the notion of having public art in squares, not just statues of sort of successful men and occasionally women in sort of top hat and tails or sort of frock coats, but actual modern art by leading modern artists. And you see the change in Swedish architecture. And Sweden was neutral in the war, so building to some extent continues right through. And you get this sort of enthusiasm for colour, tile, every form of cladding and signage. I'm a great lover of old cinemas, and the Fontaine by Baxter and Renius is a very little altered early 50s cinema of the kind we don't have here. Brazil, a whole series of books come out during and just after the war, published by an American architect photographer called G. Kidder Smith. And he looks at Brazil and Sweden, but also Italy and Switzerland, and at their traditions of architecture from earliest times right through to the modern movement. You see here, architecture, new and old. And there's an exhibition in America in 1943, which brings out the sort of wow factor of these very simple modern forms, very economical of materials, by a series of young Brazilian architects. They'd met Le Corbusier. Very briefly, he'd been involved in the building of the Ministry of Education. And the brightest spark of all, Oscar Niemeyer, lives to be about 104. So he only died, 10 years ago? And this is amongst his earliest works, a group of buildings around a little holiday lake just outside Belo Horizonte. And you can see the concrete, very thin, but by forming into a cone shape, something that's very strong and elemental. And you can see the decoration as well. And I think in America, you see this sort of same ideas taking form in particularly seaside architecture, where this term mid-century modern was coined. It's a term from the early 50s, really from LA. But in Miami, you get MIMO, Miami modern, meaning this rather kitsch style, led by Maurice Lapidus, architect for a lot of the really massive hotels at the north end of Miami Beach that go up immediately after the Second World War. And you see some of his work in Cuba from that time too. So where is this sort of zany architecture really taking us? It's a reaction to the sort of straight lines that you see in this exhibition of Paris, International Exhibition of 1937. Apologies for the quality of the postcard, but I think you can see there's the sort of German pavilion right opposite the Soviet pavilion. You have this great contrasts of or authoritarianism, whether of the right or left, producing pretty much the same kind of rigid architecture. And England, starts to recognize its own traditions. And if you go back to that magazine, the Architectural Review, you start to look, I suppose they hadn't got many new buildings that they could feature. And with Nicholas Pevsner, the historian, as one of the editors, they start to produce whole runs of historical architects, including the rediscovery of Capability Brown and this nostalgia for the English picturesque, the architecture that we're fighting for. Well, it's the English public house. It's the cathedral city. And these are all books produced during the war. And yes, the ones on the right and top are about planning and how we rebuild our bombed cities like Exeter or London, but also solve the problems of congestion in central Oxford, but also how the Englishness of English art, something that Pevsner was to lecture on in a series of brief lectures a decade later. This sort of going back to the English ideals of the 18th century, the English countryside that we are fighting for, the traditions. And these are what come out. And many of the ideas, I suppose you can see elements of that mixed with older exhibitions coming out in the first major exhibition held in Britain after the Second World War, which also celebrated an anniversary this year. It's 70th, and that was the Festival of Britain. So whereas in 1939, the New York World's Fair had the three-sided Trilon and the globe called the Perisphere, Britain has Skylon, I suppose, named by an architect's wife, whether it was sort of knowingly on Trilon or if it was on nylons, the latest fad, we don't really know, or it was never sort of divulged. And the Dome of Discovery, the sort of centerpiece of this show. So this was the South Bank. There's the Royal Festival Hall, of which more later, and this tiny site with Waterloo Station just at the back here was taken up by an exhibition that was sort of showing Britain's resurgence after the war. It was partly a trade exhibition to try and sell our goods to the world and generate dollars, because the pound was pegged to the dollar at an unfavorable rate, and the economy was really being squeezed by the lack of dollars, the lack of exports, and also a place in which to have fun and to see where modernism was going. This was a tonic to the nation. And there you see the Dome of Discovery and Skylon much more closely. And the buildings, apart from the festival hall, have gone, but you can still work out where it was. There's a plaque where Skylon was. And of course, the surroundings, like Whitehall Court, are still very much there. And it was a sort of series of buildings to be enjoyed on various levels, both mentally and physically, lots of stairs, lots of steps, and the spaces in between were just as important as the buildings themselves. It's very rare that you see photographs in colour. Again, 20th Century Society had a series of lectures, and I was given this slide by Jim Cadbury-Brown, who worked on this concourse, an Italian landscape architect called Maria Shepherd imported all these pots, which were then a novelty. The trees were sort of exported and replanted, something considered extremely daring at that time. And again, you can see timber trusses, bright colour, the latest in modern railway engines, still steam, looks distinctly old-fashioned. And I think this was a place where people could come and see a group of modern buildings for the first time, and landscapes as well. This is the back of the Royal Festival Hall, which wasn't finished. There was supposed to be a small hall on the back, and that was postponed. The shot tower of 1807 is on the site that becomes the Hayward Gallery and Queen Elizabeth Hall. And there's a slide I started with, which note the sculpture for later reference. This is a barber. A lot of very young architects employed, including Leonard Manasseh, who won a competition to build a restaurant, but the budgets were then chopped and he just got to build a bar and a lavatory. Who's most upset, but brought in his friend Daphne Hardy Henryan to produce this little sculpture. And there are loads of books and mementos, and 20th Century Society produced one of its journals, which if you join the society, you get a biannual journal as part of your membership. And this is the one for 2001, since reprinted. And here's the festival hall in the 1950s. The shot tower had been used for an exhibition about radar, but without the radar on the top, languishes for another 10 years, while arguments go on about funding the building of the South Bank as a arts complex. The festival hall has this 1950s frontage. This is what it originally looked like, with windows to the staircases. It was brought forward and refronted in 1964 to make it look a little bit more suave and sophisticated, rather than this itsy bitsy Scandinavian modernism. But inside, of course, the original design survives more or less intact. There were some alterations made to improve the acoustics in 2007, and this photo was taken since then. But you can see the boxes. It's by an architect called Peter Morrow, who'd worked with Rebeckin on High Point, and the colours, the materials, again, owing something to Scandinavian design, rather a lot to the pure modern movement, and Robin Day designing the original seats. So what was the Festival of Britain's influence? Say, apart from the festival hall, most of the buildings immediately connected with the festival itself have gone. But each county was encouraged to do something for the festival, as were major cities, and even smaller authorities had cricket matches and fancy dress competitions and pageants and so forth. And Bedfordshire, to try and encourage visitors, put up these little village signs. There's one in the centre of every village in the county, or was, and a large number of them do survive, with the festival Abram Games crest there and the newly approved Bedfordshire coat of arms on the other side. And there was a competition for the best new buildings erected since the Second World War. At Newbury Park Bus Station, 1947-9, was the standout winner. Again, simple shell structure, very much like Oscar Niemeyer's in Pamplona, that concrete skin can be used, shell concrete, reinforced concrete, can be used very thinly indeed, provided it's curved so that it then assumes a form of great strength. And there you see this plaque, Pool Pottery, featuring Abram Games' winning logo, itself the subject of a competition. And there's 22 of these around the country, one in Scotland, one in Wales, most in the southeast and East Anglia. But this idea of shell concrete becomes quite a theme, with materials in short supply during and after the war. And rationing of building materials continues until November 1954. It's a licensing system that helps the government direct materials into public housing, schools, because of the baby boom, and industry. So the places they're most needed, which means other buildings don't get the repairs that they're needed. And there's a huge backlog of demand for shops, offices, cinemas, churches, and public buildings of all kinds. So this is the oldest surviving example of a shell structure. It's a bus garage on the south side of Manchester. The new suburb of Wythenshawe relied on buses, was never connected to the Manchester tram system. And now, because it's near Ringway Airport, it's filled with cars of people are leaving their cars here so they can go on holiday. Better known is Stockwell Bus Garage of 1951-4, which is the most, I think, the most dramatic example of this sort of structure, 390 feet long, and with this upwaving to the roof and incorporating this difficult bit, cutting into the concrete to get those windows without losing strength. And you can see the beams that support the shells, and you need a very strong beam around the edge to stop movement, waving my arms around, that you might see them, to stop the concrete shells from sort of spreading out or trying to move outwards. That was the big problem. And you can see the same technology pertains in Ireland, and actually one of the very best of these sort of mid-century or festival style buildings is the bus station in the centre of Dublin, Buzaras. Without decent era, Republic of Ireland was very dependent on its bus system, and Eamon de Valera introduced a whole system of bus garages and bus stations, of which this was the centerpiece and the most elaborate bit to be realized. But you also see these sort of concrete structures as markets. This is Plymouth. Markets very important because they sort of kept going during the war, when cities like Plymouth, Exeter, Coventry were bombed and the shops destroyed. Even Marks and Spencer's had a stall in Plymouth Market, and that was how it kept going. So all the rebuilt cities and some of the new towns have elaborate market structures, something that seems sort of perhaps rather archaic until the sort of pop-up culture, I think, is starting to see a revival of interest. So what happens after the festival? What happens after rationing ends in 54? Well, you get buildings like this. This is the quintessential festival influenced mid-century building. It's on a bomb site in the middle of Walthamstow. Hands up who's been to Walthamstow lately. But this is its centerpiece, but with a clock tower, very Scandinavian. There's your wavy concrete roof. Here's your heraldic plaques and the borough coat of arms in mosaic. So you've got that historic element. You've got pool pottery producing tiles again. You've got public housing in flats. You've got a community hall. You've got new shops and a bank. So everything that was sort of seemed most essential and most celebratory of a with it modern urban district council. Here, celebrated in the central parade. Even the name suggests its importance. And architects move away from those sort of interwar sources into doing something a little bit more folky too. Herbert Taylor, the design half of life work partnership, Taylor and Green, with his partner David Green, who does the sort of services and the practical things. Herbert Taylor had a Dutch mother, knew Holland and Germany, and I think this pre-war house, just pre-war house, for a Punch cartoonist, has very strong elements of Dutch architecture, and particularly sort of Frankfurt and the work of Ernst May. There, they go settle in Norfolk, Suffolk borders, which is David Green's hometown, is Lowestoft, and inherit Green's father's practice. And their housing in the 50s picks up a lot of sort of local traditions, like pantiles, like these patterned textured brick walls, like the crinkle-crankle walls that you see in 18th century formal gardens and barge boards, and this idea of putting the date in brick on the end of a wall, something that you could see examples of looking around the Suffolk countryside. And they produce something like 1,000 council houses for Loddon Rural District Council in that sort of triangle between Great Yarmouth, Lowestoft and Norwich. A lot of sources, again, very much Stockholm, and particularly the tower block, which is a way of building on difficult land in Stockholm. Look at that lovely granite down there. Very good foundations, but very difficult to build on. Land in great shortage, tradition of city living in fairly small flats. And Backstrom and Ranius make a feature of building these punkthuis or point blocks during the war. And they're seen by Oliver Cox and Graham Shankland, who, with their friend Michael Ventris, the architect who deciphers Linear B, they go and stay in Stockholm for 3 or 4 months in 1950, just as they're finishing their studies at the Architectural Association. They've got a travel scholarship, and they come back, and Cox and Shankland get a job at the London County Council building social housing, and they take the idea of Dandig's Klippen down to the internal bathrooms and the projecting balconies and put them on the highest points of the site at Alton East, Portsmouth Road, on the southwest side of London as you're going down the A3. And they're on the site of Victorian houses so that they can keep the old 19th century trees, and they fit in the sort of smaller houses around them to create sort of picturesque curving patterns of what is called mixed development. The idea that if you have flats for single people, couples, perhaps mother and daughter living together, as was commonly the case at that time. And then you've got a lot of single women who hadn't married or lost their husbands in the First World War. And then the houses makes more space for family housing. And this becomes a common pattern through the 1950s into the 1960s. Very Scandinavian, this point block by Frederick Gibbard, which claims was the first tower block in Britain, opened in May 1951. So it's Harlow's contribution to the Festival of Britain. And again, you see these pale blue pattern tiles. Every flat has a balcony that faces more or less south, hence the butterfly plan. Very carefully laid out. And sculpture that from the festival South Bank site is salvaged by the Arts Council and offered to any authority or museum that wants it. And Harlow is actually one of the few to put its hands up and say, yes, please. And this is a precursor of the Harlow Arts Trust, and why there's so much sculpture in Harlow. It's called Sculpture Town today. Barbara Hepworth's contrapuntal forms were figures that were in the South Bank show close to the river by the Regatta restaurant, and then moved to a housing estate in the sort of first part of Harlow to be built in 1952. And standing well and happy, recently restored there. And the Harlow Town Centre is sort of epitomises all these themes. You've got the public sculpture, show a sort of idea of meat porters from Smithfields relocated to Harlow, just as most of the Harlow dwellers had relocated from London's East End. You've got the oversized clock, you've got the tiles, you've got a marketplace all happening. Again, buildings by Frederick Gibbard, master planner of Harlow. New sources from America, the Case Study Houses, which was a magazine, Californian art and architecture, later just art and architecture. And the editor, John Intenza, introduced the idea of houses that would be built, illustrated profusely in the magazine and pages devoted to their construction, and they'd be open to the public for a week or two before going on to their owners or being sold on the open market. And it was seen as a way of selling magazines as well as encouraging young architects like Charles and Alexandra Eames or Pierre Koning. These are, I suppose, two of the better known examples. And in Britain, you see once rationing starts to come to an end and private house building taking off. So the sort of simple ideas of those first case study houses, they get much bigger and more elaborate. This is Hollywood after all, later. But the early ones, very influential on early British private houses of the 50s. So like this one in Leicester, see the colour again down. There's sort of counter between kitchen and dining area, an important feature. Or best known of all, perhaps, Farnley Hay, timber frame on a stone base, lots of glass, lots of brick, lots of colour. Here's the inside, open plan, warmed by radiators, which also serve as the balustrade to this sort of study area, which is set over the dining area, all divided by steps. You see how the polished floor denotes the living area. There's a proper fireplace behind the photographer here. And there you see, and this is looking back the other way with the stone open tread stairway, Danish light fittings, and that close relationship between indoor and outdoor spaces. Peter Womersley had designed that house for his brother, and then outside Huddersfield. So textile connections introduces him to the designer Bernard Klein, emigre who settled in Galashiels on the Tweed and modernizes the tweed industry up there. So you get this sort of simple single story house, again, timber version of something that looks like it could be by Mies van der Rohe, with a sunken area to give height to the living space. Again, very, very much inspired by Arts and Architecture magazine and John Intenzer's own house, case study number 9. Or even Basil Spence down in Hampshire built himself this weekend house where he could go sailing on the Beauly River, as well as building Southampton University using a mix of brick, painted and timber. Peter Morrow, who we met at the Royal Festival Hall, designed this little house for himself in Blackheath, very much like Peter Morrow himself. Always seemed to wear a black shirt and a white tie, kind of the opposite way round. And this very monochrome palette informs a lot of his buildings. Again, the living spaces and the bedrooms are all on the upstairs floor, with a garage, little workshop, guest bedroom down below. And inside, Robin Dett Furniture, they were great friends, collaborated on exhibition design. Open plan between the kitchen, dining, living areas, and Morrow's study over here. And just touches of orange and olive green, particularly in these sort of wall pieces that Morrow made himself down in his ground floor workshop. I've mentioned already the rebuilding of Plymouth after the war, quite traditional buildings. Plymouth was the fastest to get off the ground in rebuilding, thanks to a very dynamic borough engineer, John Peyton Watson, who collaborated with Patrick Abercrombie on a master plan for Plymouth. And this was the first department store to be rebuilt. The blitzed towns, as they were called, Plymouth, Coventry, Hull, could get waivers ahead of the relaxation of building materials for elsewhere. So note that it's sort of classical proportions, modern shapes, sculptural decoration. As see here too. I mean, still, it's sort of like Art Deco, but with the curves knocked off, isn't it? And a little bit more art. At Coventry, they're, again, slower off the ground. And so artists brought in to put this sort of symbolic stone, which was laid to mark the phoenix arising from the wreckage of bombed Coventry. Visits were made again to the Netherlands, to the Lindbaan, where the first large-scale pedestrian street had been laid out. And here, a pedestrian precinct, the first substantial precinct in the country, and Smithton Way, with its Marks and Spencers, with its decoration mosaics on the dance hall, and this clock tower where Lady Godiva goes round and pops out on the hour, as does Peeping Tom. So keeping those old folklore traditions alive. And again, it's a clock tower. And again, it's got that sort of Scandinavian quality to the brickwork with these sticking out headers here. There you see it when Godiva's not striking the hour and half hour, but her sculpture there, commissioned in 1937, and the first, another of his early symbols put in to the new city centre to show that something was happening ahead of the general rebuilding. And Broadgate, that's the earliest part there, 1948. This is 1953. So really pretty early, way behind Plymouth. And still that mix of sort of slightly classical proportions with Scandinavian touches. And of course, culminating in the rebuilding of Coventry Cathedral itself, opened in December 1962, and perhaps marking the end of this sort of gentle post-war modern style, seen very much as a repository of fine art, and symbolically, again, the phoenix of the new cathedral rising from the ashes of the old, whose remains were retained and linked by this open porch. Basil Spence, who was involved in the Festival of Britain in the Sea and Ships Pavilion, wins a competition in August 1951 while the festival's still on. So the building of Coventry Cathedral, really, the sort of time frame really is that of this whole mid-century era. And inside, tapestries by Graham Sutherland, candlesticks by Hans Koper. These are all by Spencer's practice, and there's a large eagle lectern by Elizabeth Frink. So the whole thing sort of hanging together by its art. By the time it's opened, liturgically, the Church of England had moved on, but that's another story. And there's looking back the other way. There's the lectern. Lectern is there, and these this sort of open glazed West End looking out onto the city with reliefs by John Hutton, very again symbolic of the relationship of the cathedral and the city, and very elegant, thin structure by Uwe Arup and Partners, the engineers of choice. This is either about to be demolished or it may have already gone, but showing the simplicity of even of church building in the early 1950s. Asbestos problems have seen its demise and a loss of congregation. But the theatre is still there, very much modelled on the festival hall, and the first publicly funded repertory theatre coming out of the same Sixth Act of Parliament that allowed local authorities to levy a sixpenny rate, which created the Royal Festival Hall. Actors were expected to live on site and contribute to the activities of the city. Restaurants, I think this was sort of demolished just as post-war listing began in 1987 by the decoration by the photographer Angus MacBean, but a sort of reminder of the sort of whimsy of this immediate post-war era. And coffee bars, the Gadger machine is said to first appear in London Soho in 1952. Of course, these buildings really don't survive, and you get sort of high-end coffee shops like the Sarabia, like Terence Conran, later of Habitat, first commercial ventures owing to high-class coffee houses, and a lot of the architects who'd worked on the Festival of Britain or the Royal Festival Hall, like Trevor Dannett, move on to work in these coffee shops. Yeah, the Orrery, that's the Conran one. And then, of course, you get the sort of greasy spoon cafes picking up the same idiom, a few of which do survive. Pubs, once they start to be rebuilt, mostly after 1954, pick up on this patterning and collection of arts, a lot of them being very consciously domestic. This is unusual. It's a seaside pub. It's single story because there was the bungalow next door already existed for the publican to live in. So you didn't need elaborate quarters on top. But the style of the mid-century, in America, you have Gucci coffee bars, and you sometimes hear the term Gucci style for this kind of light, ephemeral, very American sort of architecture of the five and dime and the drugstore and the jukebox, so forth. Kent, apologies to all of you in Sussex tonight, but Kent really is the sort of bastion of the seaside ice cream parlour, Broadstairs or Deal. And this is probably the most complete example. I have no idea who the architect was, if there was one. Piers, which had been chopped down for reasons of security when Britain was under threat in 1940, were rebuilt. So there's Boscombe Pier, 1958-62. The pavilion at the seaward end is gone, but the landward end with this great roof survives very well indeed. And I suppose the most elaborate of all was built in the Isle of Man. If you were coming by sea to Douglas, Isle of Man, this is the building you see first, and it's three-sided. It's got three of these wings. You can't tell except from the air, like the three-legged man of Ireland. Of course, it is known as the lemon grater. Decoration later takes on a more serious form with these in town halls, the grander one-off public buildings, libraries, police stations, town halls, the last things to be rebuilt after the end of licensing. So they're hit again with the Suez crisis, and Capitol building is again deferred. There's the exterior, starting to get a bit more butch, a bit more grand. But there's a decoration, again, by artists like John Hutton, who'd worked with Spence in the Festival of Britain and at Coventry, very much involved here too. And Stevenage, that sort of simpler, rather stripped down curtain wall modernism, another American import, has a sort of brief, sort of Miesian minimalism, becomes de rigueur in the end of the 1950s, and a complete pedestrian town centre. I've just been collaborating on a book with colleagues at Historic England on Stevenage Town Centre, which has just come out. And again, of course, there's a pool, there's a clock tower, there's sculpture, and a mural on the former co-op by its in-house artist, Jura Baggio, Hungarian refugee. A lot of refugee sculptures take on important public positions. And you just see such bits of, sorry, I'll go back, sort of slightly Russian, is it? That sort of idea of Soviet realism, but with elements of bits of Stevenage, New Town, the railway coming through, and all slightly more informal and more joyous, I think, than its Russian counterparts. And this Miesian style taken to extreme by the firm of Gorin Melvin's Ward, another building threatened with demolition, just being boarded up at the beginning of lockdown when I took this picture. Scarborough Technical College, you find a lot of schools built for rising numbers of school children, first infants, then secondary. So then you have to think about higher education, the tendency of more kids to go on to higher education, whether of a vocational training here or as university. And I suppose the apogee of the mid-century style with its Scandinavian influences is reached when Arne Jacobsen, the leading Danish architect, is appointed to design a new college at Oxford University with the sort of Scandinavian brick-style brickwork and the colour and the attention to detail of architecture, landscape, all the furniture. And Jacobsen got into real huff when the pots and pans for the kitchens were ordered without his approval. That's how much he controlled the design. And I put in the sort of counterpoise British version. Powell and Moyer, the architects of Skylod, move on around 1960 to produce something that's more sophisticated, simpler in its palette, more elegant and minimal in its materials, moving away from mid-century modern to this sort of mature modern of the 1960s. There's a sort of median between mid-century modern and brutalism on which I'm now working. I'll leave you with this. Do you remember the sculpture that was outside my starting slide, Daphne Hardy Henry's Youth from the Festival of Britain? Well, Leonard managed to rescue the sculpture rather dubiously, going through the Arts Council minutes. Reference to it from the Arts Council store suddenly disappears. If it had stayed in the store, I'm sure the sculpture, like all the other ones there, would have disappeared too. Amazing lack of interest in this stuff from local authorities. So Leonard took it upon himself. And when he built his own house up in Highgate, itself now listed, the sculpture was installed in his garden. And this is sort of moving in to that honest expression of honest, heavier materials that we now know as brutalism, which is the next story in the book I'm writing at the moment. But this is the mid-century Britain building that Dan kindly mentioned, which is in your bookshop at the so money from it goes to you, money from it goes to the 20th Century Society. So sorry I've overrun. Thank you very much, and very happy to take questions.
Elaine, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. I think there's obviously people here that have specialist knowledge and people here that don't, and there was absolutely going to be something for everyone. I'm going to bring in Daphne for a few minutes just to respond to some of the points you raised. And yeah, hopefully this will be interesting and we can touch on a few more of the issues that you covered in more detail.
Elaine, first of all, thank you so much. It was so very well illustrated. I'm still in shock. I've seen building. Obviously, I'm a huge fan of this type of architecture. So you just totally made my week. And I've been trying to come up with interesting questions. But actually, the first thing you started with was the influence of Dudok and the Dutch and also the Germans, and then later on the Americans. But you mentioned that the RIBA recognition for Dudok and Frank Lloyd Wright came quite late. And I was wondering, did the recognition of those two architects come sort of together with the fact that architecture was used to sort of celebrate life again after the Second World War, where architecture was used to sort of, you mentioned the festival style. Is that a right way of looking at this, you think?
I think, well, two questions there. Yeah, festival style is a very English term for the American mid-century modern. And I thought if I called a book festival style, people would expect a book entirely on the Festival of Britain. And that American mid-century modern, I think, is becoming more generally used here. You see the term contemporary used too, but in the 50s, that was a sort of rather a term of abuse for buildings like coffee shops that weren't quite proper. But Dudok was recognised in 1935, so really quite early. I just wanted to make the point that it was Wright himself, I mean, perhaps because he'd left his wife, he had this sort of whiff of notoriety about him, that it wasn't sort of perhaps delayed him being really picked up by British architects. But there was very, very little available about him during the 20s. And then he becomes this sort of really favoured architect through the 1940s, up to his death in 1960 59 and then beyond.
Yeah. And slightly different question. Your pictures, most of your pictures show the listing that the building in the picture has been awarded. And I know a few people on this talk will know what the listing actually means, but for those of us, who don't necessarily, can you just remind us what influences the type of grading that the listing gets?
Well, I mean, from the Warr Pavilion. And I was thinking, of course, those listings are on there because that's how I got involved in the subject. Yeah. My day job's as a historian with Historic England, which is English Heritage, and before that, the Department of Environment, involved in listing modern buildings. And when the Delaware was originally listed grade 2, Nicholas Pevsner in 1969-70 offered to bring up a list of 50 modern buildings. And they were the first 50 modern buildings to be listed. And actually, there were only 37 of them in the end. I think various committees whittled a few down, and that, of course, included the Delaware. And it was when the Delaware applied for a grant that it was upgraded. And so 2-star and 1 is really essential to get government grants. It puts you up the pecking order for lottery funding. They've been a little bit more. So that's the main difference. And it means that if you want to alter the Delaware, build on that massive 6-story extension, you need permission from Historic England. Whereas if it was only grade 2, and it weren't a council connected building in any way, you'd only need permission from your local authority.
So actually, speaking of, I was also really interested in your pictures of the Festival of Britain 1951 and the South Bank and the surrounding buildings. And I was thinking, and you show the inside, and it is mostly still there. It's lovely to be in there. But in terms of and we're battling with this at the Delaware as we speak. In fact, the challenges of conservation, and specifically the inside, little details, things. Can you say a little bit more about that? How can buildings like the Delaware, how can they be helped and maybe even get hold of certain materials that will be?
Well, this is always a difficulty, and it's very hard to sort of be generalized, but I think that's probably where the 20th century can be helpful.
Good.
Rather more specialist knowledge or know how people to get to. I mean, Historic England tends to be much more reactive, but it's been doing studies, for example, on mosaics with water and the problems of water penetration and practical issues, glass and so forth. But certainly with the festival hall, and it had to it was seemed very happy to allow changes, radical changes to be made to improve the acoustics. So the seating you saw in my picture looks like the Robin Day seating, but it's new, and it's got a slightly wider modern bottom.
Yeah.
The bar again was new, the disabled access was new, and things like that, where you're trying to accept change and allowed to keep the building in use and improve footfall, then those things are allowed. A bit the way the Delaware's been through that over 40 years, I think, is a study in itself, and you're probably the best example of all.
And actually, on that note, you mentioned when we were introduced earlier today that your very first visit was in 1988. And I would hereby really like to invite you again for another visit. I know you've been in between 1988 and today. Obviously, you've been more often, but there's been a lot of work again has been carried out, and I personally feel that the current people leading the Warr are really looking after the building in a very complimentary fashion, and that's actually my last comment on this. So I very much hope to see you in 2022, and perhaps together with patrons as well. We'll see whether Dan can get this organized.
Yeah, it would be fantastic to have Elain on site, and obviously it is thanks to our patrons and also our members who have joined us today that we can continue to conserve the building and hopefully continue to do so tastefully and both develop it as well as pay homage to its original structure. We will leave the 6-story extension for the time being, Elain. You'll all be pleased to know. But obviously, thanks to our members and patrons, we'll keep working incredibly hard to conserve the building and make it fit for purpose moving forwards.
It's such an honour to come and to talk to you all, and it's great to know that the Delaware is in such splendid hands. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Elain. And thank you to Elain once again. Thank you to the 20th Century Society, and thank you all of you for giving us your time this evening.
There we go. And do support, you can see details of the society online, so do consider joining us and getting many more lectures like this. Thank you.
Thank you all, and hopefully we'll see you at the pavilion over the Christmas period. Good evening.